There we go. Hello, Brandon. There we
The
are.
sound is off, by the way.
As he wants it. So, because we have you here, and I know that you said you just wanted to listen and not get too involved. Uh, we generally don't have a topic. We just kind of shoot the shit. But
Yeah,
because we have you here, I thought it's a great day to talk about frames and aims.
absolutely. Why not?
Yeah, I think it's great. Um, and 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 I know I can be pretty hostile online. I just want you to know I actually have quite a lot of respect for you. So don't expect that I'll be pushing back too much on you. But the one thing that caught my attention in a conversation a week or two ago is that you were talking about profiling and frames and names and sort of bias analysis in terms of the work that you're doing and in terms of business and crossing those bridges with the people that you're working with. That's interesting. Can we start there? How are you using the profiling?
When we're looking at a better or a worse, let's do this as a group. Let's come together and be reciprocal. You're saying reciprocity is better, and obviously the opposite is worse. So what you're doing is you're laying out an agreement as to a frame.
Mhm.
And you could, that may be because of a name. You say, okay, the general strategy is the aim is this, and the tactic, the frame is this. The thing we're all meeting on, we're all going to agree that this is better. But as soon as you come into that's an in-group agreement within a given, area when you meet once a week or when you're in a business together. But as soon as you're crossing over to another business that doesn't follow that model, you have to actually kind of do the opposite of what you're expecting to do, which is come together and solidify and push them away and say they are the outgroup, they are the enemy, they are looking at things worse than we are. And you actually have to find a middle ground and find a new frame to work with them through, a new language, and you have whatever you want to call it. And that is sort of the basis of how I describe the spiel.
Yeah, I often think of contract as contract business, contract partnerships as really agreeing on a frame before you commence. And
Yeah.
really, the contract, you're setting the terms, setting the definitions, and you're setting the context before before you engage in anything that's going to have any consequence. Um, so that's interesting. Now, I imagine, and I've seen this in work before, where you can even have that dynamic across departments, where you might have back-end programmers that want elegant code, and you have designers that want to have an enriched user interface, and they're coming from two different frames. And then somebody from the top down, usually whoever's uh, uh, doing the creative direction, is saying, well, the frame is the business needs of the client. So it's when you mentioned that you were doing it at work, all of that kind of fell together, and I'm like, oh, okay, this isn't some hyper relativism or hyper individualism. You're talking about really establishing groundworks for reciprocity and for cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And you've got to look at the resolution you're working within, and you've got to realize when you're stepping outside that. So the resolution being, we agree that X is better, and we agree that Y is better. So we're working off those two, and when they meet, we move forward. But as soon as you're working outside that parameter, like under what circumstances does that parameter make sense, and under what circumstances is everyone involved in that agreed to those parameters? And
Mm-hmm.
when we're stepping out of that, how do we deal with that? That's kind of the key. And that's where when you're integrating with another company or another individual, you're kind of trying to integrate strategy as well as I'm calling it strategy and tactics, but the aims that come together through the actions that you do together. So it's sort of when we're just discussing philosophy online, or we're discussing sort of practical philosophy rather than sort of armchair philosophy, and we're saying, let's go about it in this way, let's come together and do this, let's look at that particular thing as a bad thing. So I always talk about hypergamy. We say, the what is it, the unrestrained hypergamic tendency is terrible, because raging men come together and they attack, and they fight and all this sort of stuff. That's the spiel, but it's sort of like very single-minded, and I think that's a really good example of where you don't you're kind of coming, you've got the frame of hypergamy is bad, you've got the evidence, but you're sitting at it with sort of, this is something we need to control. And I don't know if that's like necessarily that's not really attending to what I'm saying. That's not really living by what I was saying. You're stepping outside the bound of the frame.
Okay. Well, let's explore that, because then that gives us meat on the bone to work with. So now I'm going to assume that was off of the post that I had on the spectrum from polygamy through polyandry, with monogamy as an optimum.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I don't think I was saying hypergamy was bad, because I don't see it that way. But there is something in there. I was probably saying polyandry is bad. that polyandry itself is, yeah. So I can see that. Okay, now I get it. Now I can see where the carryover to hypergamy would be, because that's hypergamy is the female selection. Okay, so what you're saying is, in that particular case, there is a moral presupposition that's defining a frame that's unspoken or implicit, that's acting as a filter for information.
Yeah.
Okay. And in those circumstances, then, so one, we have possibly a falsely imposed limitation on the body of knowledge, the data fact value connection, that might be inappropriate. How do we detect that limit, and then decide if that is good, bad, useful, utilitarian? Do we measure that back against our aims? Do we update the frame? Like, it sounded to me like it's about limits at that point.
What we can do is we can look at it two ways, and I'd say one way is better than the other. So for more reasons. So one way is we can say, take hypergamy and say there are all these problems with it. What we need to do is limit it by stopping women doing X, Y, and Z. That's one way of looking at it, which is not necessarily a bad way. But the other way to look at it is you say what they're doing is they're selecting for certain things. They're selecting for a leader. You know, these things we know, the T-shape, the this or that, whatever each woman selects for separately, you can get data as to what they select for more, and we know these things. And what you want to do is create a society or a policy or a group of people, Sheepdog or whatever that may be, however big it is, of men who are growing up to be how you want them, the parts of them that you want to be more of. So you're like inciting yourselves to act in more of a way that brings out their attraction in you in relation to how you want them to be attracted to you. Do you see what I mean? It has to be in relation to what they're attracted to.
Right.
So if you're trying to reshape what they're attracted to, it doesn't really work. You have to work to what they're already attracted to.
All right. So by doing that, then you're breaking the utility.
So one is imposing. The first one is imposing rules on women, saying you must act in this way. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have limits. The second one is saying change your behavior in relation to make yourself more attractive to a woman, as they do to you.
Fantastic advice for incels. I know I give incels a hard time. I shouldn't, but okay. So I don't know if utility is the proper word, because utility is really consequences mapped to our aims. So one of the ways that we update that frame then is referring back to consequence, to what is actually demonstrated. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, all of these things have to be in reference to an aim. You can't look at something spurious. You can't just go, here is this hypergamy, or here is this whatever topic we're talking about, this family dynamic. You have to say, here is this family dynamic. Now, what's the resolution we're looking at? Are we looking at it in terms of the society? Are we saying, how is it producing in terms of economic value? How are we shaping this? And that's what I'm saying. Whenever we're spurting out stuff on Facebook, like a paragraph long, just a couple of little things saying, within this bound, you say, okay, now you've kind of bounded it a little bit more operationally.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, and that came out in our conversation on that one topic, that the metric that I was measuring value off of was parental investment in children. And I never stated that. It was way down the conversation where it finally came out and was saying, well, this is why monogamy is an optimum, is that it has this greater investment in children. So it's best to include a definition of our frame up front. I guess that's fair reciprocity.
And again, like, you have to work to the language. This is another point. This is like a parallel. You have to work to the language of the person you're talking to. So if you're talking to a sort of Kurt, like I was talking to 3 hours ago, you have to make everything a shape and a process, and a shape and a process, and a link and a shape and a process, and a percentage. And you can't describe it in a story. You can't describe it. It just doesn't click with him. When I'm talking to you, we're sort of feeling each other out. This is how people work. And I think that's just the other level to this profiling. You can call it profiling, or you can call it just sort of social dynamics or social cohesion, or any of these things. And I think it's another layer to all of these considerations of how to behave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and because I'd fired a shot across your bow about guys in their 30s getting interested in things like profiling and human behavior, which was just an observation I've made of myself and others, and realized that it was inappropriate for you because you had a different direction with it. Is that there was a power to it. So we're back to a utility again. The more insight you have over people, the more power then you have to influence. So I just wanted to clarify that I can be a dick online too. Do
you know the phrase "to be sure"? If someone says "to be sure,"
no, well, I've obviously heard it, but I'm thinking you have more of a technical.
No, it just means like but on the other hand. So to be sure, from all that, I think you've also got to realize a lot of this is just pure projecting. So like I'm psychologizing, or like one is trying to understand the other person, and you're kind of fitting frames, and you're testing, and but huge amounts of that process is just absolutely wrong, again and again and again and again.
Yeah. So would you say that the projection is really throwing out predetermined frames that you have to try to frame a frame match to the content?
So let's say I say to you, I was in the Navy or something. I wasn't, but you say so was I, and I just throw out like a thing that I think you would have done in the Navy, and then we bond over that thing. Mm-hmm. That's projecting, and I'm just sort of throwing it out. And if you don't bite, you might go, oh well, I did this, and I go, so did I. That's kind of how that, especially men. That's how we kind of, that's one of the ways we create rapport.
Rapport, yeah, and I think that relates back to it's finding a shared frame, or at least finding a compatible frame. So I don't think everybody's frames are better. Yeah. So okay. Oh, that was it. You were mentioning resolution, and I think resolution is really important for a number of reasons. So a lot of conclusions that we have on the aggregate, whatever data we have, patterns across large numbers, loses significance as you get into the particular. Mm-hmm. So on one hand, you can have an identified pattern across the aggregate that is almost irrelevant in any individual assessment that you make. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't dismiss the aggregate assumption. It's just saying significance reduces. And I think
there's a little rule. There's a little rule here. So it's in psychology, it's called inferring the particular from the general, and the general from the particular.
Right.
So when you're going from the general to the particular, what you're saying is two things. You're saying, if I'm making a statistical guess, and the general says that men are more aggressive than women, and I have a guess between a man and a woman, I'm going to guess the man, and I'm going to be right 60% of the time.
Right.
But what it doesn't mean is you can just say that men being more aggressive is that in any situation, a man is more likely to be aggressive than a woman, because you might actually have a singular man who's incredibly unaggressive and a woman who's high testosterone, all of these things. So those two things are really split in science. One is a sort of predictive, like all that statistics are is the art of best guessing. That's what someone told me once, and I got it seconded. They said that's a really brilliant phrase. Mm-hmm. And what you've got to do is, when you get the data, you can't, as soon as you start inferring from that data, you're stepping outside the bounds of the frame. So whilst doing that process, you have to actually
I lost the audio on some of that.
Yeah,
Oh yeah,
Lucas
sorry,
cut
did you
in
miss
for a
that?
second. Yeah.
Okay. What I'm saying is you basically have to relate everything back to the frame that you're working with. As soon I'm trying to think of an example. What do you think of this so far, Bill? What I've
I
said.
no, I think it's brilliant. I think it's timely across many different domains. Like I had mentioned the whole thing in the United States politics, but we've also just had an event here within the group that highly depended on different frames that were incompatible. And but also this idea of collapsing scales, where we're collapsing the aggregate against the particular, um, which I think is what you're getting at, is that your best guess on the aggregate. Eventually, if you're drilling this down to the particular, eventually you're popping out of one domain into another, and presuming the credibility of one domain applies to the other. It's like stolen credibility.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so and then this comes back in your business dealings. How do you deal with resolution? Because the first thing that came to mind with me is that you can have frames and names decided across the company or across two companies. But then as you get into each task, say separate departments or separate sort of crews within those organizations, the resolution is now different. Does that pose a threat to cohesion uh, with that at
Okay. So
play?
what I would say is don't build enemies. What we do online is we say we are this, the in group is this, we are more this, we think this way, we think in this mask. We have all these we do's and they do's and these ins and these outs, and that's good for building in group strength and cohesion and all of and trust and all that great stuff. But it's really bad for intra group, across groups and outs, outer group things. So in business, what I'd say is do the opposite of that, and instead of saying okay, I'm really strong. I believe this. I'm X wing. I believe in this, that. I don't believe in this. I'm not talking about morality. I'm talking about politics, religion, all of these things. And then anyone who is a Democrat or anyone who's this is sort of the enemy and slightly away. You kind of that process has to be left at Facebook. That you can't do that in life, and I think that's a really important thing. And everyone's got their ticks. It's either like, oh, if someone's just a religious nut or a complete atheist nut, or whatever anyone's, whatever your little thing is, you're two, three, four of them. Train away from them, and that's just my advice. I think it's really, really important because those people that have that one thing, if you've got 15 of them in your head, you're cutting out maybe 30% of the people you meet,
Yeah.
and
I have a huge reaction to primacy of linguistics, which you may have noticed.
okay.
That just I'm like, nope, not going there.
You know about paralinguistics and psycholinguistics?
Not very much. I've looked at the philosophical history leading to those that stem off of primacy of linguistics over primacy of existence and so
Yeah.
on. And my I actually don't have an issue with that notion of the importance of linguistics to filter cognition and the dependence of cognition on linguistics. My point has always been there is a third frame. There's a third reference point that we all work from, which goes back to the real world. So if we have, let's say we have competing frames that how did you had a way of saying it about individuals. There's no two individuals that will see the same situation the same way. We end up with this feedback loop between our frames that bounces back and forth to either separate the two or them converge. And I think the third reference point that does that is consequence in the world, and that's where my this is my propensity to measure everything morally. That without the third reference point of consequence, it opens the field up to massive manipulation. It's too loose.
Well, let me put a story out to you, see how this flows. How many times have you gone through a situation and experience with a friend or with someone you know well, and you guys basically, you almost die, or there's a really big thing that happens, and you go away and you tell the story in front of each other to friends over a beer or something, and you tell slightly different stories. And over the years, you kind of, that story adapts, but that story is so strong in your mind, it's taught you a life lesson. So it's changed your behavior for the next few years. Some things you'll know that you're doing, is, you know, let's say there's a lesson you say, I will no longer, you know, drink, drive, or whatever the stupid thing is. But that story has been adapted by the people, the person that you were with telling their story, which is their integration with, and that happens probably, I'd guess, 2-3 times a year to every person, 10 times, 5 times, whatever. And that is a really interesting dynamic of how we learn it within a society or a family, especially.
Have you heard of the term sanity signaling?
No.
Peterson mentions it. So I don't know that much about it. It seems to be the core or the drive behind human need for socialization. That we're constantly updating these sanity signals. So we're constantly kind of synchronizing what's acceptable, what's not, what's the right frame, what's the right terms.
You know about the data on people who live on their own for too long. My great aunt was an example. She lived on her own for 40 years. She just went.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, obviously she went to the shop.
Yeah.
She would go over there at 11 in the morning, and it'd be 7 in the evening, and you say, I've got to go, and she'd say, no, just one more. And she couldn't, just completely divorced from reality. Just, you know.
Yeah, and that seems to be a basic human need. A very huge human need is this interaction with other humans to update sanity signals.
No man is an island, yeah.
Right, and because I used to come across this. I used to do solo backpacking, so I'd spend 2 or 3 weeks alone in the mountains. And when you come back, there is a 2 or 3 day period where you have to adjust, like things aren't quite right, or even your timing in your conversation is slightly off, and then other people that kind of get chilled by that. So this notion of the narratives that we hold that inform identity being being sort of integrated with the stories of others that have shared that experience, it almost becomes like an air that humans breathe to maintain some sanity. To maintain a rooting in reality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it was an accident. Just a second.
Here, let me just move. Yeah, there we go. So the integration of frames. So now this sounds then like what would be a foundation, like a dynamic on the individual level, that would then lead to things like in-group identity, in-group frames, social frames.
Yeah, there's another model you can lay on top of this, which is just another little thing to think about, which is what I call occupational hazards. So you go in and you think, whenever we're building an in-group preference, we're building an occupational hazard. Find that hazard. I try and do that. That's why when I come along, it might be quite annoying. I'll say, what about this? And people say, and some people will bite and they go, maybe that makes some sense. And what I'm really doing is saying, okay, we're building this preference for this kind of behavior, or basically we're eschewing this other behavior. We're saying let's proscribe, let's cut out that behavior. And I go, okay, maybe cut out that behavior. But when you cut out that behavior, you will start doing this because it's been done before. And when you start doing this, that bad thing will happen. So that's when as soon as you cut something else out, everything else changes, and you've got to work from that. So it's almost like every time you cut one thing out, you've got to do one more thing. So it's a 2-stage process.
That's like cybernetics. So what do you mean by occupational hazard?
So I call it an occupational hazard because I saw an Orson Welles. Do you know Orson Welles? Mm-hmm. I saw an interview of him with, who's that guy? One of the American interviewers. And he said he went into a hotel once and he covered himself up in rag. And he said he was a fortune teller. And he got people in, old ladies and people came in. He told them their fortune. He got their hand out. And he said, the weird thing is, after a couple of weeks, that some of them came back and they said, wow, you've really changed my life. And he said, the problem with that is, he said, the occupational hazard. He said, I started to believe myself. And so that, for me, I've always called it the occupational hazard. When you get into something, there's always a comeback, and you've got to think, okay, I'm going to go down this path. It's sort of like, I'm going to devote my next 2 years to work, and you sacrifice seeing your children, and you go, okay, because of that, I'm going to create another frame so that I can spend X amount of time with my daughter, or however it works. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's almost like that's sort of the frame. Whenever you cut something out, you've got to work out how that changes your life and how that makes you need to change one other thing or 2 other things in your life. So it's a good frame for change. that I'm talking more personally.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like second order cybernetics. Brandon might have something. I think Brandon's familiar with cybernetics. That, what is it? The control can never impact the system without there being a second order consequence. Because all of this is a feedback loop as well, I guess.
Well, look,
so yeah, interdependence. Yeah.
There's another way of looking at this, which is each person within a frame has a certain understanding, a depth of understanding, a depth and breadth, like an amassment of understanding. So let's say we're talking about, I reference everything to tennis because I love tennis. So I'll just talk about tennis for 10 seconds. So if I say, let's talk about who the best tennis player is, or what, how do we play this game? I've got a really deep understanding. I can go into detail. You might have a lesser understanding. Someone else might have a lesser. And so when we're converging on it, we always have to go, obviously have to go to the most simple level. The person at the bottom, if we're talking, obviously 2 people is easier. Well, I'll say, oh, this is a forehand and this is a backhand. Or if we're talking about, family dynamics, and you don't understand propertarian language, I can't bring you in on that level. So that in itself is sort of, that's one of the key frames you've got to think. What is the person I'm talking to? Am I talking in their frame, and are they sort of teaching me? You're in constant teacher-learner mode, and all I mean by teacher-learner is who knows more on the topic you're talking about. And it's really important. If you understand, you know less, and it's pretty obvious, to sort of not bow, but kind of allow the person to speak and take control of the conversation under that short circumstance. And then you see what I mean? And that's, we're always going to have a dynamic where the person who knows more takes control of the situation more. Otherwise, if you're not attuned to that, you're not making the most of the conversation.
I think that ends up being, with the exception of shared false presuppositions, I think what you've just pointed out might be exactly why people talk past each other. They can't come to terms because there is a disparate of general knowledge that isn't being acknowledged. So you just kind of,
It'd be better.
Fire missiles at each other. What's that?
It'd be better to frame it as understanding rather than who knows more.
Right.
Who understands better. You're talking about the process of sharing each other's frames. Andy's making sure that we don't break other people's frames when we talk to them.
Right.
Otherwise, they don't have a place to stand from to talk to you.
Right. So you can't impose the frame.
With what I consider the pace being quickened as we move forward through time, there's a question about how deeply entrenched in mud are we willing to go to pull people out? We're running down on a clock. There are some people who are far enough behind that yelling to them that they're behind is the best we can do. I can't strap a rope to you. I can't pull you along.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking about this with friends the other day. There are people who are out there to obfuscate. I've been attempting to relay that in the difference between nuance and ambiguity. Some people are looking to add the nuance of a situation and tell you that there's a better decision that you can make, or that you can look at things from a fresher perspective. But other people are just adding ambiguity, so it's hard to make any decision at all.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Very useful. That's a useful dynamic to have along any conversation. It's good.
Yeah, and I often use the dynamic of nuance versus detail, because nuance tends to have that postmodern argument to it, where it is introducing ambiguity. But yeah, I like that. Nuance versus ambiguity is less loaded.
Yeah.
It puts one person firmly in the realm of doing something immoral.
It does.
If you're adding ambiguity, you're looking to be irreciprocal, or at least to pull one over on someone. So to purposely blind a situation, to purposely pull away from the knowledge that could lead to someone acting, then we're in trouble.
Yeah.
The only way we compete against this place is to act. Every moment of indecision, or people adding to the moments of indecision, or people adding to the product overlay that adds to what option paralysis and creates more and more indecision, we tip and tool towards bad. And it's quickly that unproductive turns to evil, because it's harder to make the gains up that you lost. You
Which
lost
then
it.
incentivizes more thought, yeah.
You're playing a more urgent game each time you allow an unproductive conversation to go on, or you have an unproductive, interaction with someone. Things go badly.
Mm-hmm.
So we're attempting to relay clearer frames for perception moving forward. We've trained people to be skeptics. The skeptical frame is a terrible one. It's a terrible one. You're always looking for something to be wrong. There's always somewhere where something's not going to be perfect.
Regardless of the strength of anything before you, you can always cast out. That was my issue with critique. It is very easy to find a way to cast out, even as simple as just changing definitions or something.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to have a balance of cynicism. I always say cynicism is the key to failure, which is like not the key, a key. It's sort of like if you want to achieve an aim and you say, I want to lift this many weights per whatever a day, and you say, no, I'm not going to do it, and you put it down, you put it off, you're going to fail. If you cynicism is just the perfect ingredient to fail. But then also at the same time, if you're not critical of a situation, which is in its own way cynical, you're just gonna fly through life and kind of not have any strong aims because you're not going to find those little nitty gritty problems. So it's sort of like a balance of cynicism or balance of let's do this criticism thing. So critique is more like mindless criticism, mindless negativity,
It's like the cigarette lobby. All you need to do is cast out on the evidence.
Critique is the crowd. It's the crowd jeering at the people in the arena. That's how Roosevelt would have put it.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Well, you don't criticize the man in the arena. Either you're in the arena with them, demonstrating that you can do it better, or you're the peanut gallery.
Yeah. Right.
It's not nice. It's not nice, but we've created 2 generations of critics.
I would say more than that. I'd say that this precedes me by about 15 years.
Awesome. 5 generations.
Yeah, and I think that this goes back to action again. We're talking about aims. We're talking about consequences. But at the end of the day, it's actions. And those that are in the arena are the ones that are acting, which means they're the ones taking on the risk. They're the ones that are in that feedback loop with consequence. Therefore, the ones that are primed to be updated. So I've often said that you can't speak about truth theories and you can't understand epistemology until you've put a lot of deep thought into what knowledge is. Because the definitions of knowledge, whether it's warranted true belief or justified true belief, are circular definitions that circle around that word true. And that's a problem. And until you get your head around that, the rest is really just arguing for preferences. And that knowledge is a belief, and that the difference between knowledge and belief in terms of the terms we use colloquially is that knowledge is a belief where there's enough warrant to suspend doubt that you can act with confidence. Then from there, once you get that, it is a belief. We're not talking about certainty. Certainty doesn't exist. We're talking about the suspension of doubt or the management of risk to the degree that you can act with confidence. Then you can start talking about truth, and then you can start talking about epistemology from there. And that sort of opens the door that, yes, there are different frames, and there is a relativism to knowledge and to truth within certain bounds, but those bounds is action and consequence. That knowledge is provisional, that truth is provisional. It's subject to being updated. And if you're not in the arena, you're not subject to being updated. There is no progress forward.
It's an excellent addition to what to say that those in the crowd jeering don't improve through doing so.
Right. Yeah, and I think to a great extent it prevents anybody else from doing so as well. So I think there's a distinction here, is the difference between a skepticism that turns in on itself to be detrimental is the point in which we become cynical. Like, skepticism is good, cynicism is not.
If you're jeering from the crowd is keeping people from the arena, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah. Yes. Now, there was another thing that came to mind. Oh, yes. We were talking about the interdependence of structure and agency. Because the more that's coming up through this to me is that we're talking about or it appears as though all of this is complex systems, non-linear iterative systems. That is not A leads to B leads to C. It's that A leads to B that feeds back into A that causes C. And then we're talking about cybernetics in the Ashby sense, cybernetics and cybernetic basins and so on. That we not only have this feedback loop between structure and agency, but we have this feedback loop between agents.
Define structure again.
Okay, so structure in sociology, they're saying sort of anything at all that frames or is a determining factor of an agent is they just broadly call structure. So that might be social norms or
creates form and function.
Right, and it might be the common lexicon, the language that you're in, social norms, your past history, all of that would be considered structure. And the argument within those fields is that a person is not an individual or an agent until they can act in opposition or outside of the structure that they're imbued in. So this is the idea that if you're white, you are racist. You're contributing to a system, and any arguing for that system is only a reflection of the structure impacted upon your agency. So you're not acting as an individual if you're arguing for the status quo. Mm. And when I was looking at that, I think it's a flawed notion because I don't think structure and agency can be considered in isolation. Agency, to a large extent, is a reflection of the structure. And now with talking with Andy, the interaction between agents, this updating of frames, I think feeds back into the greater structure. This is how we're creating societal structures.
Well, basically, we have to never divorce our frames too far away from. I don't know. I call it overstretching, but it's really hard to lay it out without an example. But you basically each time you're inferring from data, you're pulling yourself into what you might call a secondary frame. So you're talking about something. You're saying, let's see the height of people in Holland, and you say men are this tall, women this tall. You do it compared to England. You say women and men are taller in Holland, and you get the data. And as soon as you infer anything from that, you create a new frame. You say, well, that means that X, X, X. And then you test that new frame. That's kind of a second order test. And then when you get the data from that saying, now with our new frame, we've got this data, and then you make this new, that's a third order. Every sort of order you get away, I don't know the mathematics behind it because it hasn't been tested. You're losing it. You're losing a sort of a geometric amount of reliability and of warrantability of
resolution.
Of each time. It's not even resolution. It's actually the amount you can trust your data.
I see.
You're reframing the data. You're not reframing the data from this is as close as you can get to reality. Your reality is I'm picking the height of men and women or whatever it is. Then you're saying from that I'm going to infer this thing, whatever it may be, and then I'm going to retest this thing. But you're retesting this thing as a new frame. You're not retesting it from that frame. Then you're in because it's got an inference between it. You've inferred something, and that inference may or may not be true. Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? You've created a hypothesis, and then you go from that. This is how science works. Then from this hypothesis that becomes the norm, they say, well, this is a truth, which is actually a third order hypothesis. And then they go, okay, we're testing these things. And then they say, well, they infer this, and then they test that. So each time, even when we're talking about it on Facebook or you're discussing, sorry if this is getting complicated, I'm trying to keep it simple. When you are testing a factor, a hypothesis, and you infer from it, that's I keep talking about the bridge, and I keep talking about there are two types of bridge. One is a subjective valuation, and the other one is that gap that I'm talking about, that inference, because that inference is a subjective valuation.
That's right. Yeah, and it's that's that because people talk about the fact value dichotomy, and I say it's data fact value, and the data is meaningless. It's just raw, and until you have a frame to explore the data set,
Yeah.
None of that data is a fact. What decides that it's a fact is the search that you're making, and that width is now irrelevant with this data, but we're looking at the height of people in Holland. So their width remains data, it never becomes a fact. And then once we have that fact, we make a value judgment, and that's what makes it valuable. Valuable as in X equals 2.
Mm-hmm.
In understanding that things like facts and values don't float there independently in the world, separate from us, that we just pluck from the tree, that we're doing something with it. The data is raw and meaningless. Any meaning we put on there relates back to our intentions with it. So you're saying that as we make more and more of these inferences, we get further and further away from the actual I don't know if it's the data or the reality of it, which makes me think of when with Kurt's operationalism is like almost an attempt to account for these bridges through these inferences, and setting a constraint saying any bridge that you make has to be an operational one. It has to have this cost.
Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a much simpler way of explaining operationalism than using propertarian definitions.
P removes your impetus to use asymmetrical preference. It removes preference from the equation by using reciprocity. It's not necessary to talk about preferences. It's necessary to create limits that allow the best outcome to emerge. I can tie it back to the beginning of the conversation here when you're talking about hypergamy. It's not what does hypergamy do when it's present in the environment. It's what conditions made arise the situation that brought you hypergamy. What were the limits that created the emergence of this strategy in this environment? And whether or not,
yes. Can I just build on that? So what Brandon has said, what Brandon's just said, is the other side of the coin of what I said half an hour ago. It's absolutely perfectly said, in my opinion. Well, I really like that. I'm going to rewatch that. So if you can tie that together with what I said before about hypergamy, then that makes perfect sense. What you're doing is you're changing the behavior of the group out of the selective group of things that the conditions under which the women are selecting for, and you're saying we are going to behave in that way, that way, that way, and that way. So you're going to the attraction mechanism between the two people is going to be tailored to how you behave because you're aware of the selection group.
So you guys touched on the Achilles heel of the frame that allows in ambiguity. What maybe 10 minutes ago, when you were talking about being the thing that's able to step out of your frame. But that's not only that, you have to also see the necessity of your frame to be the thing that can step outside of it. You didn't emerge outside of your frame. Your frame created a thing that can step outside of it. The necessity of your frame remains.
Yes, and then
it's a performative. In order for you to have created the frame, you're performatively saying you value it. It's a performative expression. Yeah, of course.
And that third reference point, the necessity of the frame, now ties us back into reality, ties in a necessity of operationalism, and ties back in consequences.
You can't destroy the container that allows for the emergence of robust agents. And just because you step outside that container and critique it, it doesn't mean you can create a better incubator for the things that that container is creating. Not until you prove it to me. I'm biology all the way down. I don't pretend that I can build a mechanical dog. It's not something that I'll be able to do in my lifetime. Not one that performs like the ones that I breed.
Okay, so can we say that there's a distinction here between stepping outside of a frame into an arbitrary position, or stepping outside of a frame into something like consequences or utility?
What's an arbitrary frame?
So I would say that if we are going to analyze a frame, the value of a frame, it's measured against something. So I would say that that's always going to be aims or utility. Or we can step out of that frame into a moral position or into a religious position or a cynical position, and these would be arbitrary because there is no foundation for that unit of measurement. that critique is really stepping into an arbitrary position, the third point to measure, to make the line, measure the line. And that the third point in which we gauge the values of frames is always going to be coupled, I'm making a grand generalization here, always going to be coupled to utility or consequence. Now that's going to have a value judgment as well, because that utility and that consequence is going to be measured by our aims, by our desired outcomes.
Or is there a shared underlying framework that we all have, which is no matter what bias you're pursuing agency to get that bias? It's the shared frame.
Yeah, I would even take that a step further and say that we all do share that third point, and that third point is the fact of reality.
Yeah, I mean,
I watched some of you, Andy, and Kurt and Rick earlier, and Kurt said he referenced something about being sure that the system was correct from the top down, but not from the bottom up, something like that. Or you can explain it from the top down, but not from the bottom up. I'm sure that there's a bottom up explanation for reciprocity. It lies in biology. I wouldn't be so hard pressed to push the work if I didn't think it was.
Yeah, well, Piaget did some good work on that, on the biological.
Piaget is good in that area.
Piaget.
Yeah, that's even come up in neuroscience with neural economy. That cells are essentially trading an action for calories, and if the action isn't resulting in calories, they'll adapt, and this is where we get neuroplasticity. That's a reciprocal relationship again.
Well, you've got mutualistic symbiosis with all sorts of creatures, you know, from bacteria to, you know, to birds and crocodiles and all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I target in on the higher IQ left, because look, under the current conditions and the technologies that we have, I'm not unsure that we can't change parasitic behavior to symbiotic behavior with a few changes. It's only about using your networks to influence the system in the opposite direction. Not like it's rocket science. You are doing things that are ruining this place. Clearly, stop.
There's an evolutionary advantage to having parasites, though.
Sure.
They keep us sharp.
Yep.
So we were talking about Wells earlier and the time machine, the notion of these very weak and lovely, you know, elites growing into these food for these underground dwellers. The parasites and predators are the drive to adapt, to socially adapt. So I don't think it's the end game is to eliminate these things, but just to adequately suppress them.
Well, yeah, then you have that idea of optimal resistance, isn't it? It's like how far can you push anything, whether you're weight training or you're trying to remember numbers, or you're trying to get better at something. How far are you pushing it before you're going too far? How much weight are you lifting before you pull a muscle? And that itself has to be framed around your aim. Do you see? If your aim is to lift as much weight as you can, it's going to be a very different thing to if you're trying to lift 10 kilograms as many times as you can. Do you see what I mean? That's you can permeate that across all these sort of fields. Anyway.
That's interesting, because I think people on the right are measuring the societal value based on stability, intergenerational or intertemporal stability, and the left is on quality of life, which only has that one lifetime in mind.
Yeah, it is sort of
R,
and it is sort of R, and it's a selection mechanism, isn't it? It's long term.
Gibbons and baboons.
Mm.
Okay, brilliant.
Well, what else are you working on at the moment in terms of what we were talking about?
For myself, I had a bit of an insight. It wasn't an insight. It was given to me by Kurt when he called me the professor, and that the really what I do well is maybe educate. I don't think it's necessarily educate, but maybe clarify or translate down the ladder, but also applied P. So although I'm very interested in politics and geopolitics and so on, I have a very limited frame of agency. So when I'm looking at something like P, it's like, what do I do? and because I'm in a very limited situation, it ends up being in a personal context. So when he had mentioned those two things a couple months ago, I'm like, okay, I'm reevaluating my position in all of this. So I think my mind is going to be turning more to personal application and interpersonal application of these kind of concepts. I think that there's a real danger in a lot of the aggregate conclusions that we talk about that can be hugely detrimental on a personal level. So I'd like to address some of that. And then, and what comes out of that, I think, is a more, it's identity again. Identity is just a shared frame. A more fleshed out or more detailed definition for the rest of us, for the group. What does it mean to be sheepdog, or what does it mean to bring this stuff into your life? That's kind of where my mind is going. So there's that, and I'm looking at putting a course together on E prime, which is a stepping stone into testimonialism. Not so much as it being some sort of aid to learning propertarianism, but because it's an excellent tool in clarifying thinking. It really, I think it's very good at revealing the frames that we're working within. So that's partly why I've been a lot more quiet online, because there's not enough of the controversial stuff to post when you're working on the personal level. So
yeah, what I try and do is follow people who express themselves in a way that maybe I'm not as good at them at within their, how do you call it a frame, you call it a language. I prefer in this term it's a frame, but let's call it a language, which is, Kurt has his sort of 2 or 3, has his sort of funny haha joke stories, and then he has his very methodical ones, and then everyone's got their 2 or 3 ones they slip into. And I try and, when I communicate with you, I try and speak in a certain way, and I try to get the most and understand the way you do. I'm basically trying to learn your language, and I'm trying to learn Curzon, I'm trying to learn this other person's. And I only really, there's some sort of hierarchy mechanism going on in my head, picking these 6, 7, 8 people out of a few hundred and just deciding that it's these people that I've decided, and you do your own, Kurt does his, everyone's got their own, and that's kind of how I'm learning from people, because we've all got such a wealth of knowledge that the other people don't have. I've got this whole thing about how differently we think, but how differently we can, obviously our minds are so differently set up and so differently executed that we can, if we intermingle our knowledges, it's geometric again. It's one of those things.
Becomes a super brain. So have you drawn any conclusion about these 5 or 6 people, that the styles to the benefits that you see from each of them?
Yeah, what I find is when they get people who follow them, or it follows the wrong word, where people who listen to them and integrate with them and argue with them and agree and help them move forward, and sometimes do the opposite, they all feel a weight on their shoulder, and I'm projecting they feel a weight on their shoulder, and that weight is it changes their behavior into a relationship between the people they talk to and themselves. It's very much how, like or dislike Hitler, it's what Hitler did. He built up a story, he explained something, and then he listened to the feedback, and when people cheered, he did more of that, and he adapted it as to how people, so it's not that he was leading and following, and then going back and speaking to his so it's sort of like, I found this with, a lot of the sort of, the mid leaders, as it were, the people who are leading conversation, they are, the responsibility leads to, I don't know, just more mature behavior. So I find my interactions with you, for example, can be quite combative, but they're never grating. They're never sort of insulting, and, oh, you're a dick, and I'll go, and
or it hasn't been for a while.
well, but we can do it as a joke, and it's fine. But I think in the end, we've kind of got that base level of we're on a level, we're both trying to improve, and we could do, all that's going to happen is that the more we talk, the lower the barrier to entry is every time.
Yeah, and I also find that when we do have conversations, we do manage to dig deeper into those levels, where a lot of conversations just sort of stay on one level. We do actually dig into things, and it's beneficial, definitely beneficial. Now, I don't know. Have we exhausted this topic? Should we carry on? How about, I've muted Lucas and Michelle. I have no idea if they can. unmute themselves here. I'll unmute and see. Does anybody have? Oh, there we go. Oh. Okay, well, I'll mute Michelle again because we're hearing her personal life.
Because they started this late.
That's funny. Any questions? Spencer's here. Alon, do you have anything?
So one of the things that stuck out to me here was when we're talking about having clear communication across the frames, one of the things that I've noticed with the people in our circles, we'll do more like a demonstration and you try and make a clear explanation. And then if someone disagrees with you, it's not about shutting the other person down. It's just someone else makes their thing. It's not a big deal if people disagree. Whereas, which is almost maybe a bit of a contradiction with King of the Hill a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think that they come into complete conflict. Richard and I actually kind of argue about this all the time. Richard loves the combat, and I don't like it. It is not that I'm not combative. I used to fight. You know, it's not about being a man and being. It's just about getting that base layer and improving from it. If I call you an idiot and say you're stupid, and then I quote you and I say, oh, look at these 2 lines you did here. Look how bad your English was then. Actually, you made a silly. You know what you didn't, and also that what you said here doesn't fit with what that. And it's kind of like, when you get into that, which I just try and I get into about twice a year, 3 times a year. Obviously, you're being counterproductive. So I think that attitude of, even if someone grates on you, let's say your annoying thing is when people, I don't know, naxaled, like Bill might have thought I did, or, you know, someone, and you just go, oh, can you, and you just fire one out. Rather than firing one out, just do a, I call it doing a Sky Stewart. He's a guy on Facebook, he's a very smart guy. And he'll just ask a question. If I get really bothered by something, if someone writes something really intensely stupid, and I actually like them, I think, I'll just go, what do you think about that thing there that you said, and then that, and tying that, and I just, and it's not patronizing, I just go, that's it, and then I just wait for the reply, and by then I'm kind of like, okay, do you see what I mean? Rather than
giving you a moment of pause. Yeah, Sky is brilliant. I love the stuff that he pushes, or not pushes, that he posts, but he's always been very brilliant at navigating those tough conversations across really disparate people. He's really worth the follow. Yeah. Okay, let's see. We covered aims and frames, got into a little bit of cybernetics. What specifically do you do, Andy?
I do about 3 different things at the moment. I'm in shipping, so I'm shipping things across the Mediterranean. I'm project managing, so that's in construction, and then I manage my funds, which itself kind of takes 20 hours a week.
Right.
And other than that, obviously, I'm working on online. I try and do. I said half an hour, but 45 minutes a day on Facebook is my kind of thing for that writing, and then I write for. I sports write. I do some sports writing for tennis and football and rugby and cricket.
Oh, nice.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I didn't know that. You had a lot of experience with IQ, from what I understand.
Yeah. I looked into it when I met Dr. Richard Lynn about 8 years ago, and then I found out that he went to PFS. He spoke for X amount of years, and there are 2 main IQ guys. Is it Richard Heyer? I think it's Haier, and Dr. Richard Lynn, and they kind of they dispelled my cynicism towards IQ. It was cynicism, and it's now skepticism. It's now sort of, okay, IQ has this relation to this strength. It's very mathematical now. It's very it's more shape now. I've got sort of a shape to the strength of IQ in relation to, let's say, job perspectives, or this or that, or openness, and all these different things, rather than saying, well, IQ is all very nice in it, and you can do nice sums and you can twist things in your head, but actually it's no good in this situation or this. And it's more of an asymptote. It's more of a kind of, when you have a higher IQ, you find things easier, like you find more things easy. And it doesn't mean you get more things. There's all sorts of caveats to that, and that is a general statement. So obviously, in the particular, it's rubbish most of the time. It's rubbish 15 to 40% of the time. Almost half, a significant minority of the time. So IQ it's a tricky one, because also when you get above about 156 to 158, you get a lot of feedback where the brain is, we don't know exactly what's going on, but you know, you get all sorts of, so we call them social oddities, but really it's just the brain acting in a way that's so involved in the shapes that it's got that it doesn't conform to what we'd call normal social norms. It's not always social law, and some people feel it because they're too sensitive, they've got overactive brains. Other people are underactive in terms of stimulation of brain, and they're just sort of they're out of it. Do you see what I mean? So everyone's got such a different, it's almost like IQ is one band of information you need, or it's almost like it's you know, you say the personality traits, the big five, or you can put anyone along a scale. I think IQ is just one of those, and it's very important along some scales. It's not everything you get complete. You actually I get some really good insights. Like Morris's IQ is 133, or I think it is, and I have conversations with him. I met him. He came to Putney. He came actually down the road. I bought him a Guinness, and he had some insights that really blew me away. And actually, just one, which is the simplest thing in the world. You can get taught this lesson 20 times, and it never hit me like this. He said, his thing is he's so busy, he has so much to do and so many things. What he does, he gets his problems and he puts them in a place, or in a group of places in files, and he knows where they are, and he puts them in, you know, organizes the importance. So he never carries them with him. It doesn't matter if he's got a huge deal in, you know, 2 hours, he's sitting talking to the person he's talking to. And I think that's probably, other than listening properly to the person you're talking to, that's the best single thing to do in business. The best single thing to do is to be focused on what you're doing. That's kind of your aim in the day, is to have a well enough structured plan as to be able to have a bit of leeway and to be able to focus on what you're doing in the moment.
And being able to set it aside where you know you can
That's what Moritz taught me. Well, that's what Moritz helped me be able to frame in my mind, such that I think, okay, I really can put off that thing that's incredibly important tomorrow, but I'm not actually going to think about it today. And to be able to not think about it, that takes training. You need to train yourself to go, no, it does not help. I think that for my brain got it by saying, it doesn't help me by worrying about it today. There's zero help. And finally it just went, nope, not going to do it. And there we go.
And then it reduces cognitive load, so you're free to do what you need well. I've been flirting with the idea that there's different types of IQ. Like there's long time horizon IQ that I think we associate with most people that have IQ. I think there's also short time horizon IQs, which I think we see in the arts, or people that are very good at synthesizing things. And then I think we have people with very specialized IQs. Like I have a very specialized IQ. So for the most part across the board, I'm an idiot, but I have one vector that's very high that raises my general ability. So let me ask this: is IQ under contention? The arguments that we see quite often come up is, oh, well, IQ is false. It depends on the testing. Is IQ really something to be doubted?
Well, you can call it the G factor. Have you heard of the G? Yeah, and IQ and G, they sort of overlap very, very strongly, but it's basically one's general ability to manipulate patterns laterally and longitudinally, sort of across dimensions. And it's sort of like, how many can you do across how many across, and how many three-dimensionally? And whether that's letters in terms of language, in terms of verbal ability, in terms of delivery of words, whether it's mathematical ability, or whether it's shape, you know, all of the tests that you have within the IQ that's what it is. It's one's ability to manipulate shapes along dimensions.
Right.
That's what the IQ is, and that helps you. And you just got to think it's the same thing. The frame and the aim. So the frame here is what this thing helps you manipulate shapes along dimensions within your mind. Okay, that doesn't necessarily help you in manipulating machinery. Obviously, you get those 180 IQ people who cannot change light bulbs and things like that. So it doesn't necessarily translate across. So you've got to think, my aim is to change that light bulb. My frame is that my IQ is incredibly high, but it doesn't fit. You see what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah, I found I didn't think that I was necessarily all that bright until actually a few years ago. And what I found was, when I was working within this core competency that I didn't know I had, things fell in place easily, to the point that I didn't trust the work that I was doing. I was going, there's got to be more to it. So you dig a little deeper and go, no, there's more to it here. And you end up doing far more robust and rigorous work around that topic because it comes easily to you. You don't quite believe it's complete yet. Whereas you have somebody that's working outside of their core competence, just to do a very superficial job is difficult for them. They feel that the vigor was done. So that became helpful to me. And I had this pointed out to me. I was taking over project management on a pharmaceutical marketing company. He was the one that pointed out, you're very good at this. And I'm like, are you kidding? I am disorganized. I don't have the temperament or the personality traits for this. And he's like, trust me. And then when he explained why he thought I would be good at it after I'd been in it a while, this gave me this sort of a litmus to know when I'm within my core competency or not, and when I should then be delegating and say, okay, this this is better for Ro, or this is better for Richard.
Next time I'll talk about training the elephant. Jonathan Haidt's Rider and the Elephant. So the rider's your conscious and the elephant's your, let's call it non-conscious. You could call it subconscious, but everything that's not the conscious. So whether we're talking about homeostasis or whether we're talking about dreams, everything that's your body does that's non-conscious. And that's the elephant. That's the thing that seems to be, or we can model it as separate from at least our thoughts. And do you know how the metaphor goes? So you're trying to ride the elephant, but the elephant is strong. And so what all you can do is you can train it very slowly. Let's say you have a propensity to get violent or something when you drink. You can choose to not drink, or you can find out which alcohols make you violent. Do you know what I mean? You can investigate that. And what you're doing is you're saying, okay, I can't control the fact that when I have whiskey I get violent, whatever the thing is, but I can control the fact that I either don't have whiskey, or when I have it, I do this. Do you see what I mean? You're navigated by training the elephant. So what I say is always learn, always try and find new competencies, new areas, whether it's new things to master, because you never know which ones are going to be your core topic. You might slide into something and go, oh, this particular field that I'm now 56 or whatever age I am, and I have such an interest in it, and you give yourself 9 months, you go into it, you give yourself a few hours away, and suddenly you go, this is the thing with which, if I'd have done at 20, I would have done for the rest of my life. And
right.
You only find that out if you keep prodding these new areas constantly. And I think it's for each person to decide whether they're prodding 2 areas at once, hard 10 hours a week, or whether I tend to do lots of little ones, put lots of little time into different things, whether it's like a new sport, a new language, a new business partner, like talking to you on a Sunday night, you schedule it in and you just think, how thin do I want to spread myself?
Mm-hmm. That's brilliant. I think that one of the greatest human advantages of things like the Renaissance was that you had so much talent tied to a land in serfdom, that exposure to ideas and opportunities that unleashed this human capital. And now we're at a point where individually we get so tapped with our time and with our resources that we're reducing our exposure to ideas and competencies, and we're almost slipping back into
well,
that.
This huge problem of just too much information is like, I realize now, you think of like communities having a certain idea of way to live. You think of like wartime England. I do, because obviously my grandparents talked to me about it as a kid, and it was one way of doing things. We have a ration, and we all have this amount of butter, and we all get together on a Friday and we have fish. They all have certain things that they do, norms. Obviously that's a very stressful situation over a period of years, but when we're fractionated, like in, let's say, London, I'm not making an argument for, I'm not talking about sort of immigration, I'm just making an argument for community norms. It becomes, that fractionation, it obviously is coming through in the media. We're not just BBC 1 and 2 anymore. In England anyway, BBC 1 and 2, there's now ITV and Channel 4, and only the elder generation watch TV mainly. Then it's the side, are you a Fox person? What is your media outlet? And obviously that's just media. And then you've got, are you a member of this sporting club? Are you a member of this? So the fractionation, especially, let's take London, as I said, or Toronto, just about, the middling cities all the way up to the higher populations. It's a very strange set of experiments that we're doing, because that's what we are. We're inside an experiment, basically. We're inside a living happening of our city, and it's in London. Certainly, it's a very strange feeling these last 5 years, I'd say, for me anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was having this thought. I was having a great conversation with a young man in England, or in London yesterday, there are so many exceptional young guys around us. And we were talking about these social frames that we have are no longer localized. So we have common interests from people all over. So we have that going on right here. People all over the world, but we're finding a common space on a Zoom meeting. But there are so many of these other frames that inform our cognition and inform ourselves that isn't overlapped because we don't have that proximity.
Well, I think this is where we've got to look into biases, because for all of those things that we've been talking about, I think you've then got to think, you know, I'm always prodding people thinking that, like profiling them for biases, but the first thing you need to do is realize what you are. So you know, you got to, if you say you are right winger, you are biased against the left wing. If you say you are pro X, you've almost got to, every topic you enter into, if you say, I prefer this, I'm going into this with the mind that I prefer one side of the argument, you've really got to attune yourself to train opening your mind to the other side of the argument. You don't have to agree with it. It's not about agreement. It's about attaining information. So let's take climate change. I don't want to go into the argument. I just want to say there's a huge amount of evidence one side and there's a huge amount of evidence another. You can disagree or agree. I'm not adding value judgment here. I'm just saying there's data. If you say you are a climate change nut or you're an anti, you are not going to look at the other data. You think you will. You're scanning, oh, that's rubbish.
Exactly what's going on in American politics right now. And what I found interesting about American politics right now is that it's one of those situations where they're not cherry picking data. They're looking at the same data set almost completely and living in completely different realities about it. Like, it's fascinating to watch. It's one of those few things where it's not just they're only looking at this and they're only looking at this. They're looking at the whole data set.
You know, I relate it to the same thing, which is having an argument about, there's a play called Art by Yasmina Reza, and it's about these two guys who, it's in a room, and they look at this square bit of art that's just this white board, and they're talking about it's, you know, a few £1 million, and they go, oh, that's, God, it's really brilliant. And they're talking about, you know, and after all, one goes, you don't think it's just a white board? And then the other guy goes, what are you talking about? And obviously the point is that of like how we subjective, and then they end up being really good friends and having a laugh and getting drunk and all that, and talking about like old stories and stuff. And it's a good play. But what it said to me was, it spoke of a lot of life and a lot of how, are we arguing about data? Are we saying this data is different to this? Because that's a different argument to saying, are you saying, you're bringing this argument to me without this data. I'm showing you this data. You're now going, wow, there's this data, and we're having a new conversation, which helps us both. Or are we arguing about the art? Are we saying that's an amazing bit of art? No, it's not. Because if we're having an argument about art, let's just have a drink and a laugh about it. Let's not actually engage in that scientific realm.
Mm-hmm.
And we've always got to say, are you having an argument about art? Are you having a completely subjective argument? And if so,
that's interesting. That's an interesting way of looking at it. I have a funny story about that. When I lived in Asia for a year, and the best hub to fly around Asia is Bangkok. So I had a crew of other fellow travelers. We'd all been on the road for about a year, that we would meet up in Bangkok and then drink whiskey, and it's amphetamine-laced whiskey. So you're up for 3 days playing pool and stuff. And we wandered out of the tourist areas and to an art gallery. It had a little pub in the bottom, and it was a local friend that we'd all made at this art gallery. So we go there after hours, and we're having a drink with them, and they're saying, oh, the art's upstairs. So me and my buddy, and he was from England. I think he installed security systems. He'd become quite wealthy, but very working class. We go upstairs, we're looking at the art, and they had mentioned there's one room. Yeah, really have to check it out. It's really interesting. And we walk into this room, and it's an overhead projector screen. And we walk in, and it's just white snow. And we're standing there, the two of us, these low class guys, we don't know what the hell we're doing. We're looking at it going, well, what is this supposed to be? And everything else. And we're up there for about 15 minutes trying to figure this out. And our other buddy comes up and realizes that when we walked in, we had kicked a cord that had disconnected the computer from the overhead projector, and we've just been looking at white snow trying to figure out the art behind it. So yeah, we can be idiots over here.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think there's another thing to overlay onto all of this sort of this interacting with people through building common frames, I think there's the occupational hazard, one way of looking at it, of doing that process, which is very helpful. Of, me and you, let's work off a frame, let's get our definitions, and let's bash it out, let's talk about it, and get somewhere and move on to another thing and do the same. Is that you become hypersensitive to people who are not willing to meet you in the middle, and very disagreeable people who are often very insightful and smart and hardworking and have all these great insights and are very useful to you, and you can be useful to them, and they can be reciprocal. They may not. They may resist that frame. Like someone like Josh Jepson, for example. If you try and bring him onto a frame, he'll just say fuck off. He'll just say sorry, mate, fuck off. And he's quite a smart. I'm not saying good or bad things. I'm just saying he might be someone with something to give in some area, or someone of that ilk, or whatever you may say. So I think what I do is I try and say, it's almost like try and give people a chance. I don't have any time for people who are just swearing and going, you're an idiot, and breaking the conversation down. But if someone's engaging and they're not quite, if you're saying, listen, you're not like Aaron. I don't know if you saw the conversation I had with Aaron, or Arno Carland, his name's Aaron. And I said, he's a friend of mine. We used to arm wrestle together. And the last time we drew, and I promised him I'll win the next one. And we were arguing about memes on one of Brandon's posts. And he just wasn't getting what I was saying. And I don't think I was getting what he was saying. We were talking past each other, and we're good friends. And it just got to the point where it just became completely unproductive. And I just thought, okay, this he's such a disagreeable guy. He's a smart guy, German, Australian. And anyway, we got to an end, and we haven't really messaged about it since. And I think that's the worst case scenario when you're actually two friends, you're not willing to lose your friendship over it, and you're willing to talk, but you really can't match a frame. And I think there's something to be trained there I'm not really understanding. So maybe there's some room for improvement in that area.
Well, I think there's also, I mean, my dad used to talk about the evolution of hunters, where you try to kill everything, and then eventually you want the big game, you go after the trophy, and then it ends off with you hunting with a camera, because so there's this evolution that you go through. I think there's an intellectual evolution that people go to, where you get to a point where it's like, I've got a good enough frame, I've got a good enough concept stack now, and I'm not exploring anymore. I'm not vetting. I'm going to stay here, and I'm going to try to go deeper. And I think that those people quite often are ones that don't want to deviate from the frame. Even if it's not even disagreement, it's just like, I don't want to waste my time.
Sometimes it's important for them to do that. Sometimes they have to do that, yeah. Because
you can't go deeper. And so quite often in those situations, I try to gauge it and go, okay, it's not that this is necessarily a stubborn guy or he's telling everybody he's wrong. He might be just at that point of fatigue where he's just kind of resting in this one spot for a while. And try to give some space for that. There's room for us to disagree. What's that?
I want to abuse Andy's artist or art frame. We're always arguing about art, at least in the spaces that we're discussing human norms and actions and limits. Because
very true. Sorry, let me just delineate. Let me just frame that one more.
Human action in space is artistry.
Yeah, what I meant more is if you're arguing about something without any relation to an agreed upon measurement, then you're arguing about preferences.
Oh, okay. I thought you were, yeah. Okay, yeah. So I was right. Arguing about preferences.
People are trying to sneak preference in under the guise of art. Piss Christ is not Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. They're not comparable. They're not art on the same scale. One's art and the other isn't. One's art and the other's destruction. Artistry, that is what bad. So artistry that's destructive or non-productive. It's like the epitome of evil, using your humanness to go in the wrong direction.
Do you know what I find hilarious is I don't think any of us, well, maybe I'm wrong, are particularly like outstandingly, maybe Kurt's an exception, well understood art. It's like our brains aren't structured. We're not artists. We're not absolute. And I went to a TEDx talk about a week ago, and the talks were quite good. Some of them were all right. And one of them was two artists talking to each other, a German guy talking to a Dutch guy. And I was transfixed by them talking about art. And I was sitting there and I didn't have a clue what they were talking about. I've got an understanding of things. I've read a little bit of art. I can understand what people are saying. I can put things together, but I was waving in and out of understanding what they were saying. And I realized it was one of those resolution things. They were talking way above my pay grade. I didn't have a clue what they were saying, but they were almost they were 3 levels above me, dumbing it down 2 levels and kind of almost laughing about it. And I was struggling to keep up. And I think that was a fascinating experience, trying to, an experience of when you're fascinated by something, you're trying really hard. They're trying to pull themselves down, and you're just like, oh, I'm kind of getting what you're saying there.
Yeah. No, the interesting thing is the connection of art with preference, and Hutchison's attempt to connect ethics with aesthetics, which I do think that there is something to that. I think we have a moral sense that we experience as beauty. And I think that sense can be that sense is malleable and subject to things like ideological framing or intellectual framing.
Wouldn't you say beauty, like it feels right? So if you see something ugly, you feel wrong. You feel, or you could just say negative, wrong or negative. Whereas if you see something beautiful, you feel lit up. You feel engaged.
Or touched. Like I say, the hallmark moment where we're seeing actions between, whatever, some sweet moment. How does that register to us when we get that welling up of tears? Well, it's that's so beautiful.
They've smuggled in the righteousness of outrage
into our sense of morality.
Destructive art. It's smuggling in outrage as righteous. If you get a sense of disgust is a hard feeling, like a sense of love or beauty. They're both visceral, primal reactions to something.
Mm-hmm. And I like
one you're supposed to decide whether you cherish it, and the other you're supposed to decide whether you destroy it.
Well, it's become an exploration of subjectivity, where I think that around 100 years ago, arts included things like industrial arts and craftsmanship. It was an exploration of expertise and mastery.
Mm-hmm.
And that I liked Kurt's point that the art of a civilization matches its prosperity, and that it becomes a celebration of the success of their survival strategy.
Oh, that's absolutely true. Yeah.
Yeah. And Peikoff, Peikoff is junior high stuff, but he has the dim hypothesis where he attempts to map out changes in aesthetics and changes of integration of information from different eras.
Oh, so Florence is brilliant. When you look at the rise of Florence and Venice as well, when they peaked, and the art that matches the rise and the art that matches the fall, and you map Florence with Venice, you see a really similar elation in the rise and a really similar darkening. Obviously, it matches the shape of the decline or the incline, and it's just
wow. The one thing that blows me away, which I think are not for common people, are the sculptors of the 19th century. I think were a pinnacle of sculpting. Look, I used to be a sculptor. I used to be an artist with exclusive showings and the whole works. Just a personal note. I think the specifically the sculptors of the 19th century were mind blowing. And then that's the peak
area of the world, Europe.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, in Europe, and I think specifically it would, some of the artists that I were looking at were Eastern European, Germany and England.
Okay.
Specifically those areas, and that kind of sort of maps to the peak of those areas as well, right? I need to wrap it up. I need to go pick up my daughter. All of you, thank you for taking the time, and Andy, thank you especially because of the time difference.
Brilliant. And send me the file when it's up and running.
Oh, definitely. And I'll post it and post the links. I would love to do this again.
Any comments from anyone? Put it on afterwards, and I'll address them as I can.
Perfectly. You want to do that? I can post the video on Facebook, and they can comment there, or we can post it on YouTube, and they can comment there. I think it's probably better for Facebook because we all seem to be on it. Okay, so perfect. I will do that.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you guys. Have a great week.
See everyone later.